A very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, and welcome to our session today on rights-based ecosystem approaches to a green, just recovery hosted by CIFOR. It's great to be connected through the GLF, and so before we get started, a big shout out to all the GLF team working behind the scenes to make this event happen. My name is Steve Leonard. I'm your moderator today. I have a long history of working around the globe on international environmental law and policy. I've had the benefit of working professionally with a number of our speakers on a range of important issues today related to Indigenous peoples' rights, climate change, and biodiversity. Today, we will hear from a group of well-respected experts. We'll hear the science basis with supporting facts and figures as to why it's so. I'm sorry, I need to, MJ, there's a problem. The screen keeps on changing in front of me. We'll hear about CIFOR's long-standing global comparative study and lessons related to tenure, rights and participation, which can contribute to financing a just recovery, and we'll hear about the critical linkages between the climate and biodiversity and health crisis and risks associated. In this session, we'll show you how these things are all related, and we'll question the utility of the current fragmented approach. Before we go any further, we need to ask the audience for some participation. So we're going to go to Slido, and so we're going to ask the audience to participate for a moment here. So there should be a slide that should come up on the screen that shows the login details for Slido. Just waiting to see that slide. So here, if you go to slido.com, enter the hashtag GLF biodiversity and go to our event. If you scroll through the events there, you'll come to CIFOR Rights. Now, if you go into CIFOR Rights there, you'll see our first Slido question. So we're going to be asking the audience to be entering the two words that come to mind when you hear the term just recovery. So we're wanting to hear from the audience in terms of the two words that come to mind when you hear the term just recovery. And so this word cloud will be something that continues throughout the session, and we can come back to this as we go. So moving on, today we have a great list of speakers, some people that I've had the benefit of working with over the course of a number of years. My name's Steve Leonard. I'm your moderator for the session. And so our first speaker is going to be Nonette Royo, the Executive Director of the Tenure Facility. And Nonette will talk to us about rights-based approaches and the work that the Tenure Facility is doing concerning Indigenous people's rights and securing land tenure. We'll then go to an expert panel, and on that expert panel, we'll be hearing from, we'll have Virginia Young, who will be speaking with us about holistic approaches in terms of policy and looking at the Convention on Biological Diversity and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We'll hear from Kate Dooley from the University of Melbourne, who will be talking to us about some of the risks associated with approaches to carbon sequestration and carbon dioxide removal and biodiversity. We'll be hearing from Christopher Martius from CIFOR. Christopher's had a long history with CIFOR with the REDD+ Global Comparative Study, which also looks at REDD+ safeguards, which address biodiversity, rights of Indigenous peoples. And Christopher will be drawing lessons from the REDD+ Global Comparative Study and looking at a range of different financial instruments that can be supporting protection of forests and ecosystems. And we'll also have Tonio Sadiq. Tonio is an Indigenous representative from Canada who was on the editorial board of the second Local Biodiversity Outlook. And Tonio will be speaking with us about the importance of rights of Indigenous peoples and biodiversity approaches. So before we cross to our keynote speaker, Nonette, perhaps we can just check in again on the word cloud. How are we going there? Maybe we'll cross to Aya. Aya's going to be co-facilitating this session with me and tracking what we're seeing in the interactive sessions. And so perhaps over to you, Aya. What are you seeing there in the word cloud?
Hi everyone. Thanks, Steve. So there's I'm not sure if it's a bit of a lag. Okay, so now I'm seeing the word cloud. Let me just see which words are coming up. Okay, so we have very obviously one of the biggest words is equity, and very close second is equality. So I think those two words are really resonating with people when we talk about just recovery. Other big words on the cloud are restoration, and also participation, fairness, inclusive, justice, equitable, holistic. Inclusivity is also there, like inclusive, and fair, and agroecology is also appearing to be one of the bigger words. And there are a number of smaller words, but I think those are about 10 to 12 words that are most prominent.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for that, Aya. So now we'll cross over to Nonette. So I've had the pleasure and the honour of working with Nonette now for a while on a number of issues related to land rights and Indigenous peoples. And so Nonette is the Executive Director of the Tenure Facility and will provide us with a keynote address. Thanks, Nonette.
Thank you, Steve. Greetings, one and all, from all regions of the world joining us today. We are here to ask ourselves and share our insights about how to deliver a green and just recovery using rights-based, ecosystems-based approaches. Let me start by asking, what rights and what ecosystems? As a legal practitioner, I will not be able to give you the science of linking biodiversity loss and climate change. But I can share what I have experienced about rights, especially in my work as a lawyer for Indigenous peoples and local communities the last 30 years, that taught me about the palpable links, or lack of them, to biodiversity loss and climate change. Rights are relational. It defines relationships between individuals and families, families and groups, groups and communities, communities and nature, its users and protectors. Especially for Indigenous peoples, having evidence of their land rights allow them to maintain good relationships with each other, with nature, with their governments, and use the law to assert and protect the forests, their homes, from being destroyed. Healthy ecosystems are good for climate, as they exist in equilibrium and depend entirely upon a diversity of species. Most of these critical ecosystems fall within Indigenous territories, and they are actors for millennia in that equilibrium. While the world's 350 million Indigenous peoples make up less than 5% of the global population, they protect over a quarter of the world's land area, supporting 4/5 of all biodiversity. Research shows these lands store 33 times as much carbon as total energy emissions in 2017. Protecting the ability of forests to keep this carbon on the ground is essential. On the other hand, unrecognized community land rights contribute to high deforestation rates, largely driven by financial interests. In the Amazon alone, critical ecosystems the size of Sweden are threatened by mining inside indigenous territories. Rights-based solutions, approaches means recommitting to the fundamentals of that relationship that is based on interdependence, respect of life, basic freedoms, properties between people and nature that sustains them. Our panel of experts will give us more of the service, science, and economics of these relationships. What I can share is that rights are fundamental, simple yet broad. It is both formal and or customary, public and or private, individual and or collective, and it attaches to people and also to nature. We made enormous progress to make laws to define and regulate these rights, nationally, globally, but we are not good at implementing them for all. Many governments seem to overlook, especially those with little financial resources to claim these rights, and those who only speak Mother Earth's language. We are facing a crossroads, one towards the sixth mass extinction, and global temperatures are still rising, but the other towards recovery. Additionally, the coronavirus pandemic raises the stakes and forces us to embrace uncertainty like we have never done before. Our scientists estimate that we can recover over a third of all required emission savings to keep global temperatures increases under 2 degrees Celsius by 2030. This can be achieved by managing the world's lands and forests more sustainably, avoiding biodiversity loss, land use change leading to habitat fragmentation and loss. So as we race to recover and find the right solutions, we say we build back, but no, that would not work, because what we did with the land before the pandemic got us to this mess. So we build forward, or we use other terms, adapt an eco-social transition towards a different global economy that will challenge the business as usual production, trade, consumption patterns. Concretely, we learn to rely more on each other. In recovery, we do our part and we allow those closest to forest to do theirs. This is the principle of subsidiarity, most useful reminders for us. The type of forest that will save us now are not the trees we plant today. These are the standing forest, ancient forest groves in the last largest tropical rainforests of the world, in the Amazon, the Congo Basin, Indonesia, PNG. Indigenous peoples have shown us how to effectively manage these lands and forests, and evidence point to the environmental, social, and economic benefits that accumulate when they are empowered to protect these lands. Deforestation rates are 2 to 3 times lower in secure indigenous lands. The rights-based approach ensures that indigenous peoples get formal rights and or receive recognition of their customary rights, and that their responsibility and work to protect and secure these lands are sufficiently financed. This automatically secures an ecosystem. The policy work we do so far, all of us, continue to remind us that it is as much implementation of basic rights as positive legal frameworks, as legislation itself. It is as much the fundamentals, the basics of community organizing, as negotiations and due process using consultations and FPIC. It is as much about possession as title itself, and it is about being on the land, an active governance of the land, applying the principles of subsidiarity and polity as much as jurisdictional approaches. And for this to happen, financing is very important. Not to depend on receiving grants and doleouts in green recovery, but to reinstate the fundamentals that people empowered with secure rights and with the right support of their properly functioning government and distant business partners can generate the resources they need for weathering this uncertainty. Finance and financial instruments need to ensure inclusion, and build capacity of local people and local enterprise, and not only targeting the benefit of big business and big projects. Tenure facility success across several countries, including within the regions where we are seeking to expand, have clearly demonstrated this. For example, in Peru, organized indigenous peoples who have had for decades seen the lands polluted and destroyed worked hard to get their titles. In May 2019, the Peruvian president attended a ceremony in which 66 communities received legal recognition of over 650,000 hectares of their territory. President Vizcarra participated, and this boosted collaborative efforts between indigenous peoples, the state, and civil society to achieve government's plans to title 1 million hectares. This newly formed alliance across stakeholder groups is exemplary for the types of outcomes we all can achieve within challenging contexts. We all have a historic opportunity in the next 5 to 10 years to reverse the decades of chronic underfunding for initiatives that support the rights and governance of land, territories, and resources of indigenous peoples. This clamor for rights to right these wrongs had been growing. Green just recovery means meeting the forest guardians, the local and indigenous peoples where they are, for more informed financial and technical support to bridge their local visions with global visions of a just, sustainable, and equitable world. A green just recovery means recognizing indigenous peoples and rights holders and supporting their full participation in all actions that determine their future. Thank you very much.
Welcome back, and thanks, Nanette, for those important words. I can't agree more on the importance of the need for there to be a shift towards Indigenous peoples being considered as rights holders. This is something which I think is really very important. And so now we will turn to our expert panel, where we will hear 4 short addresses from our speakers, all who are very much experts in their field. Our first speaker, Kate Dooley, joins us from Melbourne, Australia, and will be presenting on different approaches to carbon dioxide removal as a solution to address climate change and the risks to biodiversity associated with these different approaches. Our second speaker is Christopher Martius. Christopher has spent a great deal of his time recently looking at different financial instruments related to forests, ecosystems and ecosystem services in the context of the Green Climate Fund. He has a long history as a part of CIFOR's global comparative study on REDD+, and will be presenting on a range of different financial mechanisms that could be used to fund ecosystem protection and restoration, as well as drawing lessons from REDD+. Virginia Young also joins us from Australia. We've stacked the panel here a little bit with Australians, with Kate, myself, and Virginia. Kate's from the Australian Rainforest Conservation Society and has also been involved in research with Griffith University. Virginia works very closely with the IUCN and will be presenting on challenges associated with the current fragmentation of the international policy spaces concerning climate change and biodiversity. Tonio Sadik is our fourth expert, and he's the Director of the Environment Sector of the Assembly of First Nations in Canada. Tonio was on the editorial board of the recently released second Local Biodiversity Outlook, and Tonio will be talking to us today about the intrinsic relationship between Indigenous peoples and local communities, traditional practices and biodiversity conservation. But before we turn to our speakers, I just want to encourage the audience to use the chat function. So you would have seen earlier where we had the interaction there with the word cloud. Now is another opportunity for the audience to be interacting. But this time, as we go through the speakers, direct a question to the speaker. Include your name and the country that you're watching from. And as I said, the speaker that you'd like to answer the question. We'll have time after this session to go through and ask each of the experts a question based on what comes into the chat. And Aya, who's helping me here with the facilitation, will be watching the chat closely. We'll have another interactive session a bit later on. So I think it's time to turn to our first speaker. So Kate, you're our first speaker. Now, we're seeing an increasing amount of approaches as so-called climate solutions or nature-based solutions, which seek to remove carbon dioxide as measures to address and recover from the current climate crisis. But these measures, of course, need to ensure that they don't harm biodiversity in the process. Now, you've been studying this area recently through your work with Melbourne University. Could you tell us a bit about the recent findings from the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, sure. And thanks, Steve. It's great to be here with such an amazing panel. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a paper that I just recently published at Melbourne University on this topic of carbon dioxide removal and its impacts on biodiversity. So as Steve mentioned, we will need some level of carbon dioxide removal for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees. And carbon dioxide removal can take a broad range of approaches, from technological approaches to ecosystem-based approaches. And there's been, recently, the last couple of years, there's been a lot of talk about nature-based solutions with really the idea that nature, so the way I see the phrase nature-based solutions is people are thinking that nature can play a role, can be a solution to this carbon dioxide removal question. But it's not always clear what exactly nature-based solutions are and if they're going to benefit biodiversity and respect rights. So we had a look at the impact of the whole broad spectrum of carbon dioxide removal options on the drivers to biodiversity loss. We thought the direct drivers to biodiversity loss. These are land and sea use change would be, actually, we'll just go back to the previous slide. I'm still on that one, thanks. So land and sea use change would be is the leading cause of biodiversity loss, followed by resource extraction, invasive species, pollution, and climate change itself is also a driver to the loss of biodiversity. So we divided all of the different kinds of CDR options up into these 4 categories that you can see here. Carbon dioxide removal that relies on land use change, that relies on regenerating nature to some regenerating different types of land use, marine-based approaches, and chemical approaches. So chemical approaches includes things like enhanced weathering and carbon capture and storage. The first one, land use change, includes afforestation and reforestation. Now, nature-based solutions probably go through all of the first 3 categories. Like all of these categories, people would consider nature-based solutions. Afforestation, reforestation. Some people might consider bioenergy with carbon capture and storage a nature-based solution. I would have to say I definitely wouldn't. And then in the regenerative options, we've got ecosystem restoration, soil carbon restoration, agroforestry. Under marine, we've got ocean fertilization, artificial upwelling, and regeneration of coastal ecosystems. We've called that blue carbon. So what we then did once we divided these up, because these are divided on the kinds of processes that are needed to remove carbon dioxide under these different approaches. So if we go to the next slide, we then, this won't really make sense to you, so don't worry about that. You would have to really read the paper for this to make sense. But all these little icons represent one of the different drivers to biodiversity loss. And red means that that CDR process had a negative impact on those drivers, and blue means it had a positive impact. And when there's both colors, it was depending on the management and governance of the way that CDR option was implemented. But what the findings overall showed was it's only regenerative options that have an overwhelmingly positive impact on biodiversity. All other kinds of CDR, of carbon dioxide removal, negatively impact biodiversity, and that includes anything that relies on land use change, because as I said at the start, land use change and sea use change is the leading driver of biodiversity loss. So I find when people are talking about nature-based solutions in the context of CDR, they're almost always referring to afforestation and reforestation. And these are potentially very dangerous approaches because they require potentially large areas of land use change, reforesting an area. There's a lot of risk then when you're changing land use of not respecting rights, of potentially displacing Indigenous peoples or local communities. So we need to be really careful when we're talking about carbon dioxide removal that we don't just use a broad label like nature-based solutions that could cover all of these things. I could go on with examples if I had more time of how most of the marine approaches are also very harmful to biodiversity and ecosystems. So the point here really is we need to be very specific, like we need to restore nature. It is a viable CDR option, and it restores biodiversity, it can enhance biodiversity, and as Nonette said in her keynote speech, protecting and respecting, recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples is a way to also protect and restore ecosystems. So these two things go hand in hand. And that's why I think it's really important we talk about ecosystem approaches, or specifically rights-based ecosystem approaches, and not nature-based solutions, which is a label that's often applied to approaches that can be very harmful. Thanks, Steve.
Great, thanks, Kate. Yeah, I mean, I think I find it particularly interesting as to the level of risk there that you've emphasised, especially when it comes to one of the more popular approaches that we hear being spoken about in the context of restoration and reforestation. I think that's a really important point that seems to be coming from the research that you've undertaken. So we can come back to, we'll hear more from you as we go through the session when we get to the questions. Now, we'll turn to our second speaker now. So Christopher Martius. So Chris, the research that's been undertaken by REDD+ over the years has seen a great deal of data collected and findings produced related to REDD+ safeguards, which includes biodiversity protection. CIFOR's work on REDD+ has also looked a lot at ecosystem services, both carbon and non-carbon. And it's looked at the importance of rights, tenure, participation of local people, all as key components of the overall effort to be protecting forests and reducing deforestation and forest degradation. Now, you've been recently looking at REDD+ finance, as well as other financial mechanisms that can be mobilised to pay for these measures to protect, restore forests and ecosystems. Could you provide us with an overview of the range of financial instruments that are being deployed and what you've learned through the research undertaken by CIFOR that could be of benefit perhaps to people that are involved in project and program design and development to protect and restore ecosystems? So over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Steve. Yes, REDD+ has been on our focus, in our focus for the last 10 years now at CIFOR. And by the way, the Global Comparative Study on REDD+ team yesterday just had a fantastic workshop on REDD+ in Indonesia. If you missed it, people can look it up on the website. I think I'm sharing the link in the next slide. There is particularly a very interesting contribution from Professor Everett Engelson. No, not. Don't go to the next. Professor Engelson, who spoke on results-based payments, of which REDD+ is of course one of the mechanisms. And here you also see the names of the contributing people to this work. Particularly also my colleague Stibniati Nia, Oscar Reyes, who has been working with us on financial instruments, and then yourself, Steve, and also Kate, who has just been talking to us previously. And I'm very honored to be on this illustrious panel of Australian and also non-Australian people, and I enriched the ranks of the latter. So I look forward to the discussion later. It will be very, very interesting. The next slide, please, now. So we worked indeed on REDD+ finance, and we did a study looking at OECD data, at the OECD database, and as you can see here on the left, on the right side, basically what is tagged as REDD+ funding is about 17% of the overall funding that goes into forests and fighting deforestation. So on the light blue tops of the bars are what goes directly into REDD, and the bottom parts are what goes into forests more generally. And you can see that's more or less between 1 and 3 billion per year, or between 2008 and 2015. We don't have later figures so far yet. And so that's, I mean, 3 billion or so per year might be the current figure, and that might look like much, but if you compare it to the numbers of on the left side, the mitigation potential, and actually also the costs of this mitigation potential of realizing it in developing countries, which are between 150 billion to 190 billion per year, according to our estimates, then you see that we basically look at very low numbers that are currently being realized in regard to what is actually needed. Of course, I'm aware that I'm comparing apples and pears here. The REDD funding is not the whole climate funding that is needed out there. So the total climate funding is a bit bigger than the 3 billion here, but still we are pretty far from the 150 to 190 billion. And so actually we should be aware that we are probably comparing cherries to grapefruits or something like that, and in terms of the amounts that are currently being dispersed. And so it's clear we need more climate finance. We need more private climate finance, and we need more differentiated approach to funding. And next slide, please. We have been looking at financial instruments, and you can see them here on the left side. So REDD+ is a payment for ecosystem services or results-based payment, and you see a lot of the other instruments. And basically, what we need here is look at how these instruments can be made useful in the context of climate solutions that involve also the people that are actually on the ground, indigenous peoples and community and forest communities, and poor people living in and near forests. And this is very often not has not been considered sufficiently. Particularly, we need to look at risk reduction, because very often going into financing actions on the ground in the sort of green arena of nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based solutions means for large investors and also for small investors like smallholders and farmers facing larger risks than they currently have. And so guarantees, equity, and all these tools, they need to be broken down in how they apply to the situations at hand in forests and in land use. And but when we say we need to have more finance, I think we need to be careful that it is also not only looking at more finance and asking for more finance, but also basically producing the political environment that allows this finance to flow smoothly. The moment we ask for more finance and more finance will flow, there will be also more opportunities for corruption, for misuse, and so on. So it has to be very clear that we need, what we are saying here, better regulation, better frameworks, and integration. We need what I'm calling, abbreviating here as PATA, participation with indigenous people, with gender, with youth, and so on, with underprivileged people on the decisions. We need transparency, so that we can get to greater accountability, and we need adaptation to the situation on the ground, because not every mechanism works in every situation. Particularly, payment for ecosystem services have been suffering from blanket approaches applied everywhere, and that has given this particular mechanism a bad name. And so because people basically have not reflected the local conditions well enough. And finally, a word on safeguards. And if we look at all this, we need to stop looking at individual mechanisms as sort of silver bullet solutions, and then ignore all the rest. Or if we think about the rest, put it in safeguards, sort of something out there that is not actually related to the mechanism. I think we need to go for much better, more integrated ecosystem-based solutions that reflect rights, that reflect sustainability, and that reflect all these principles that I have just mentioned here. And yeah, that's my message. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Chris. I mean, just as an additional side comment, I mean, one of the financial instruments that you mentioned there is debt for climate swaps, and something that I've recently had the benefit of doing a bit of work on. It's an area that's increasingly becoming of interest, especially during the COVID pandemic, because so many countries that are most impacted by COVID are going into further debt, and so there's a lot of discussion out there about the potential triple wins that could come from more focused emphasis on debt for climate swaps in terms of supporting reduction of debt in developing countries, as well as protecting ecosystems, and then having the additional climate and health benefits. And so we'll move on. Before we move on, I just want to remind the audience to put your questions in the chat box there. So Aya is keeping a close eye on that, and we'll be coming to the questions very shortly. Include your name, where you're from, and the speaker that you'd like to address your question. We can't, of course, address all of them, but we'll be identifying a few there. Okay, so now Virginia, over to you. You've been heavily involved in the UN negotiations related to both climate change and biodiversity. I've had the benefit of working with you in the climate negotiations, where we've had many conversations about the linkages between the UNFCCC and the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's always a conversation that I enjoy, and it's not often that we have the opportunity to speak with someone who has the experience and works across both spaces, because there really aren't many people who are working across both spaces. So it would be great to hear from you as to how much collaboration and cohesion is there between these international spaces, and how are they going about developing work around climate and biodiversity linkages at the international policy level?
Just remembered to unmute myself. Thanks very much, Steve. And thank you, Nanette and Kate and Chris. That was very interesting. Yes, I do. I do. Oh, okay, there's a slide. I only have 2 slides. This one that really explains what I work on, and one more that will come up a bit later. So this one can stay there for a while, people who are managing the slides. Everyone on attending this session is probably only too acutely aware of the scale of the biodiversity and climate crises and the other related crises, such as the pandemic, that are really emblematic of our failure to deal with the major challenges to the health of the biosphere of our time. And it's really no exaggeration to say that the issues are so complex and the interactions between these crises so entwined that they can't be solved unless we develop holistic approaches to protecting and restoring the health of the biosphere. So that framing, I think, has been something that has been largely missing from the silos under which the UN Rio Conventions operate. And it's interesting, given that we all know that we're dependent on the natural world. That's not new knowledge. So why is it that these policy frameworks have struggled to acknowledge, let alone foster, integrated solutions to the global crises that our past failures have created? the silos, it's not just about the structure of the convention, it is very territorial when you work in these spaces. People are acutely sensitive to treading on the toes of other conventions. And so they tend to go to great pains to avoid reflecting on anything that one or other of the conventions might do that might impact on their own goals. And I suppose the most marked example really is the UNFCCC, where it has developed a set of approaches and rules around land and forests which largely ignore the functional role of biodiversity in ecosystem integrity and stable long-term carbon storage. And that, I think, is quite a profound failing. In fact, despite the very positive language on rights and biodiversity and ecosystem integrity in the preamble of the Paris Agreement, it wasn't until the COP last year that we had any COP decision on the importance of developing integrated approaches to prevent biodiversity loss and climate change. And while there's been some progress made within the UNFCCC on establishing at least an Indigenous forum, that's yet to deliver anything really concrete in the way of recognising the role of Indigenous people in protecting so much of the natural world on which we all rely. Now, you might think that the CBD would be ahead of the UNFCCC, and it is by a year. So in late 2018 was the first time that the CBD expressed concern about the fact that biodiversity loss will actually contribute to climate change because it reduces the integrity and stability of ecosystems and increases the risk of premature release of greenhouse gas to the atmosphere. When you explain this to lay people, they're somewhat incredulous that these just how entwined the two crises are has never really been properly reflected or acted upon in either convention. It's also taken a long time for the Sustainable Development Goals to really take a look at just how important it is to factor in the quality of ecosystems into things like SDG 15, life on land. And in fact, it was only last year that that issue was finally brought into consideration when it comes to the revision of that goal and the role of biodiversity in underpinning the integrity of ecosystems seems to now be factored into that review process. So I would argue, and many others, I'm certainly not alone in this, that bridging the gaps between the conventions is urgent. And the obvious bridge is that the integrity of all ecosystems matters for the success or failure of all the conventions, whether that's for stable long-term carbon storage, biodiversity protection, human health and well-being, climate resilient, sustainable development, and that biodiversity and Indigenous people underpin the integrity of many critically important ecosystems. At first glance, and Kate touched on this, the global push for nature-based solutions might appear to offer the prospect of achieving holistic outcomes. But this is being thrown into doubt by the emphasis given in both the UNFCCC and CBD to the word net. And you can pop up the next slide. So the word net appears in both the CBD, the draft CBD post-2020 framework, where they talk about trying to ensure no net loss of biodiversity. Some are pushing for net gain. And of course, in the UNFCCC space, increasingly the goal is one of achieving net zero, which looks more benign, but comes with its own set of challenges. Now, both conventions are in reality ignoring the fact that carbon-dense primary and many other natural ecosystems are irreplaceable in the timeframe set by both the CBD and the UNFCCC of 2050 and 2030 and 2050. So they become, if you include those words net, you're really avoiding dealing with the main issue, which is to maintain and restore the integrity of our natural and agricultural ecosystems. Worse in the UNFCCC, I think, is the potential that instead of focusing on the urgent need to reduce emissions from all sectors, the focus on nature as a solution may in fact become an excuse to either defer or lower action in the reduction of fossil fuels, and thereby delaying really desperately needed change in that arena. Equally uncertain is whether or not nature-based solutions simply means scaling up business as usual industrial activities that do depend on nature. They utilise nature, but they're certainly not a solution. In the long term, they're not a solution for climate change. And they're, as Kate mentioned, they potentially are hugely damaging for biodiversity. So simply scaling up industrial activities based on nature will come at the expense of protecting and restoring nature, and in many cases, the rights and livelihoods of Indigenous people. So there's a huge challenge here. The reality is really, I think, quite stark. Offsets in either the CBD or UNFCCC will encourage business as usual destructive activities and discourage desperately needed holistic action to improve the rights and livelihoods of Indigenous people, biodiversity and ecosystem integrity, and real action on climate mitigation and adaptation. And that's really all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for that, Virginia. Very interesting. So we need to move along, but yeah, I mean, I think this discussion that's happening more and more on net zero and the netting out question is a big one as well. So perhaps we'll cross now to Tonio. So Tonio, Indigenous territories are often referred to as islands of nature in a world where urbanisation and development is crashing in around them. Now, you've recently been involved in the new Local Biodiversity Outlook publication, which is the second of its kind. Could you tell us a bit about the publication, its importance, especially its importance to the Convention on Biological Diversity, because there is this interaction or relationship there with the Convention on Biological Diversity, and perhaps a bit about some of the findings there. Thanks, Tonio.
Great, thank you, Steve. Hello, everyone. It's great to be a part of this panel, such interesting information. So I want to talk about the Local Biodiversity Outlooks, which was launched first during the CBD COP13 held in Mexico in 2016. The CBD parties welcomed this report and asked for a second edition to be prepared to accompany the GBO5, or the Global Biodiversity Outlook's 5th edition. That COP decision marked a maturation in the relationship between parties and Indigenous peoples and local communities, or IPLCs as they're referred, around issues of science and traditional knowledge and how we can work together in partnership to address the common crisis of biodiversity and cultural diversity loss. Since then, working on the LBO2 has become an important undertaking for IPLCs in our engagement with the whole of the CBD. Parties, secretariat, scientists, civil society, and many others. The reason is clear. At least 1/4 of the world's land area, as has already been noted, is traditionally owned, managed, used, or occupied by Indigenous peoples. And most of the world's biodiversity is found within these ancestral areas. So biodiversity preservation benefits from the participation of Indigenous peoples. So we'll just go to the next slide, please. We see this in Canada, where First Nations have begun to be meaningfully included in national conservation efforts through the establishment of what are called Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, or IPCAs. So this is a term that's generally unique to Canada. What we see is a connection to place, a connection between specific peoples and specific environments that embody an intimate and reciprocal form of knowledge that is not duplicated by other knowledge systems. And in Canada, we are seeing this affirmed through the ever important acknowledgement of Indigenous governance, the ability of First Nations to exercise growing influence over the management of lands through the recognition of their inherent jurisdiction. The LBO2 describes this important interconnection between conservation and reducing the risk of extinction in its focus on the iconic porcupine caribou herd, a population of more than 200,000 caribou that migrate back and forth between Alaska and the United States and the Northwest Territories and Northern Canada every year, almost 2,500 kilometers in each direction. The 15 communities of the Gwich'in who rely upon the porcupine caribou depend on these animals not only for sustenance, but as a way of life. Unlike the globalized economies of the modern industrial world, where resources are purchased where they're cheapest and goods are sold where they fetch the highest price, the Gwich'in rely upon the porcupine caribou no matter what. And I'll speak more on this in a moment. The LBO2 highlights over 50 case studies by Indigenous peoples and local communities from around the world, presenting their perspectives and experiences on the current social ecological crisis and their contributions to the UN Decade on Biodiversity. Each story speaks to a vision and a commitment for building a better future, driven by solidarity and collective actions to overcome current problems. Through these voices, the LBO2 proposes 6 transitions necessary for the survival of IPLCs and for the health of people and the health of planet. These transitions are needed in land tenure, in food systems and how we feed ourselves, in cultures and what is valued, in supporting varied systems of governance, in diversified and local economies, and in reforming how incentives and finance work. As part of these transitions, we must address the real drivers of biodiversity loss, including industrial production and consumption systems that are out of balance with a sustainable world. There are many recommendations for action and for partnership that emerge from these transitions, but the 2 key messages for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework that I want to highlight are these: that the new framework must recognize, invest in, and support the roles and contributions of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and that this begins with recognizing their rights. And second, that conservation and sustainable use go hand in restoring and maintaining cultural and biological diversity, that the recognition of Indigenous territories is an enabler rather than a barrier to achieving and exceeding the conservation targets of the new framework. I'd like to end by saying a few words about what works now. First, that effective conservation and restoration of our natural world happens through a mosaic of locally tested and proven systems of sustainable use as embodied in the practices of IPLCs. Second, that locally grounded food systems provide sustainable and nutritious food options for our families and communities in good times and bad, and that COVID has only underscored this critical realization. Third, that IPLCs have safeguarded nature for millennia, affirming the critical role that Indigenous and local knowledge must play in addressing our current biodiversity crisis. And finally, returning to the Gwich'in efforts to protect the porcupine caribou herd, and I'll go to my 3rd slide here, please. In relying upon the porcupine caribou as a way of life, we see the embodiment of a different relationship between people and nature. We see a relationship that is significantly intertwined, that is to say, reciprocal, where in relying upon the porcupine, the Gwich'in are also their greatest defenders. You see, fencing off nature or objectifying it as something to be revered but not relied upon is not the way of Indigenous peoples. The relationship between people and nature must be one of interdependence. Otherwise, we risk overlooking something that Indigenous peoples have known all along, that we are nature and nature is us. And failing to see this simple truth is what has gotten us into this mess in the first place. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for that, Tonio. And if the audience are interested in accessing the local biodiversity Outlook publication, there's a virtual exhibition space that's been set up within the ecosystem of the Global Landscapes Forum, which I myself don't really know my way around, so I can't really direct you to it. But if you go to the web page and find your way through and look for the virtual exhibitions, then you'll find a space there where you can find the local biodiversity outlook and some information about it. And I would strongly encourage you to take a look. So many thanks to our speakers for their interesting and thought-provoking presentations. And so now we'll go to a quick question and clarification. So we don't have a great deal of time. We're running a little bit short on time, so we can only go to a few questions. We've been having a look at them as they've been coming in. So Aya's been helping out with that. So perhaps if we can cross to Aya now in terms of what are the questions that we're seeing come in there. Aya, perhaps you can take the floor and ask our speakers these questions.
Yeah, sure, Steve. So we've been getting a lot of not only questions, but just chat from the participants having exchanges. And it's great to see that actually some of the participants are answering the other questions from everyone. So it's a really active chat box. Since we have limited time, unfortunately, we can only limit the questions to the panelists, one per speaker. So maybe I will address the first one in no particular order. Some of the questions we've selected, maybe the first one we'll address to Chris. So a couple of people asked this: what is the difference between PES, or Payments for Ecosystems Services, and REDD+?
Okay, well, thanks. Yeah, very quickly. I mean, REDD+ focuses on reducing deforestation and forest degradation and building back forest cover and so on. Payment for Ecosystem Services is much broader. It's actually involves all types of ecosystems and specific services, and that can be much broader than actually what is covered by forests. So that it's broader than what is covered by REDD+. So REDD, in a way, is a special case of PES.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chris, for the very succinct response. I think some of the exchanges in the chat box actually also pointed that out, that it's a kind or example of PES. Next, I'll throw the next question for Kate. So one of our participants asked about agroforestry. She says, I would also be interested in positive and negative agroforestry examples. We hear very little of alley farming these days. Do you have any comments on this, Kate?
So in the work I've done and the research when we were looking at the impacts on the drivers to biodiversity loss, we only really found positive examples in agroforestry. Alley farming, I'm not an expert on agroforestry really. We were looking broadly at a lot of things. And alley farming, I think, is more common in the US, from what I understand. There's quite a lot of alley farming there. I'm not familiar if there are particular issues with it, but most of the literature presents agroforestry as hugely beneficial because, as well as sequestering really quite large amounts of CO2 in above and below ground biomass, there's also benefits, all kinds of different benefits to farms. So it's generally seen as an overwhelmingly positive solution.
Thank you very much, Kate. And the third question I will direct now to Virginia. So you spoke a little bit about, I think, the rights of nature. You touched on that. So one of the questions we got is about the rights of wildlife. The participant is asking, what about the rights of wildlife? Who will talk for them?
That is an interesting question. And there is a move within the CBD, and I'm not terribly familiar with it, but there is a move to actually include something specific in the post-2020 framework on the rights of nature. I came across it the other day and thought, I must have a look at that and see just what it is that they're proposing. But there's a Steve, you might even know more about this than I do, because there's a body of law that's been looking at this issue as a way of enshrining if you like, humanity's responsibility to protect the health of the biosphere and create some legal framework or rights around nature in a generic sense. But I'm not across the rights of nature issues in a legal sense. I come at it purely and simply from the knowledge that if we lose biodiversity in its natural patterns of distribution and abundance, to speak like a biologist, we start unraveling ecosystems wherever we do that, and we start damaging our own future, because the health and well-being of humanity is dependent on the broader health of the biodiversity and all of those elements from the deep sea to the atmosphere that make up the web of life. These were lessons we learned in school, and we seem to have, we seem to lose them periodically and think that we can unpick that web, and that somehow or other that will be a low risk strategy. So I'm sorry that's not a good answer to your question. Steve, I'm going to throw to you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, very quickly, when it comes to I think that, I mean, there are two different approaches to this. There's the rights of wildlife, and then there's the rights of nature conversation. And so I think I was looking at the rights of wildlife question a number of years ago, so I haven't revisited it soon. Tonio might even have something to say on this as well, but and it is a very interesting conversation, because I think it goes to questions around sentience. When I was looking at it, I was most interested in, I was doing a lot of work with an orangutan conservation organization, and so one of the interesting conversations around, say for example, the great apes is whether or not they're sentient beings, and I'm sure that there are a number of lawyers out there that have a certain view on this. So I think that it's not all nature, or not all animals are created sort of equally, so to speak. There are probably different categorizations there that would come up. But then there's this broader category around rights of nature, and here there has been a lot of progression, and rights of nature is even enshrined in the constitutions in a few countries, especially in South America. So I think in Ecuador and in Bolivia. I read somewhere recently that one of the reasons that Ecuador do not engage in, for example, REDD+ carbon trading is because carbon is considered to be something that is unable to be traded because of the sort of restrictions on the ability to trade in nature. And so that's probably a very sort of crude way of putting it. But then there's also a body of case law that has been emerging over the years in terms of certain ecosystems. So there was a case in India around the Ganges. There was a case in New Zealand, and there's also been some development on rights of nature even in the US. So it's a growing body of law, and it's definitely something to take more and more seriously, I think, as we progress further into this conversation. So I'll finish there and back to you, Aya.
Thank you, Virginia and Steve. And maybe the last question to Tonio. So we've had to sort of sift through the questions very quickly towards the end, but this is one of the questions that a few people have asked. So I think it would be good to respond to this. Since we have mentioned nature-based solutions across a number of presentations. So some are interested in finding out, how do nature-based solutions contribute to biodiversity loss? So could you talk a little bit on that, Tonio?
Yeah, for sure. The issue of nature-based solutions is an interesting one, and in some respects, I think, is a stopgap in the current context, really because of how severe the crisis is that we're facing with respect to biodiversity loss globally. The work that I have been doing, certainly, and others as well, of course, is really about focusing on what Indigenous peoples have to contribute to our efforts to stop biodiversity loss. And the nature-based solutions narrative is, in some respects, borrowing elements to how Indigenous peoples have always looked at and interacted with nature, but not necessarily in the full breadth that Indigenous knowledge sort of prescribes, depending on the context that we're in. And I think of concepts that are embodied in Indigenous ways of knowing that relate to holism and reciprocity, which I spoke to in my presentation, but also 7th-generation thinking, which is really reflective of long-term thinking and staying in place. And staying in place refers to the distinction between how we have come to imagine the world in this globalized context, which is to say globalization, rather than the importance of peoples and places and the connections that they have there. And the nature-based solutions, I don't want to oversimplify in any stretch, so this is certainly a generalization, but nature-based solutions don't always meaningfully embody the full breadth of knowledge that's required to bring that Indigenous sensibility that is more grounded to the dialogue that's unfolding. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tonio. Some more comments and questions are coming in, but unfortunately we are running a little bit behind, but hopefully our participants will keep chatting and exchanging ideas in the chat box. But before I turn it over back to Steve, a number of people are asking about Kate's research. They're asking where they can access that. So I think we can either, I can paste the link in the chat box if you can send it to me, Kate. Or is there maybe in the virtual exhibition that Steve mentioned, is that somewhere that they can check resources?
Yeah, the virtual exhibition is dedicated to the LBO, the one that I'd mentioned before. But there are a number of virtual exhibitions there. I think that there are some resources that we can look at uploading. So we'll speak to the GLF team about where we can make sure that any resources that have been mentioned are available. Okay, so moving on. Thank you very much, Aya, for helping with that session, and thanks very much for the interaction. Now we are going to continue with the interaction. So I mean, you know, your opinion, and I say this to the audience, your opinion is important. Your views are important. Your expertise is important. We are quite confident that there's a number of people who are watching this who do have expertise to offer, and so we want to spend the next 20 minutes or so doing something which is perhaps more interactive. Maybe you've learned a thing or two during the session, or perhaps you have something to add. And so we want to now give you an opportunity to have your say. So in terms of the information that's coming in, we plan to use this information to inform the GLF outcome statement. So after every Global Landscapes Forum, there is an outcome statement that is produced. This is a document that is then sort of put into the history books of the GLF, so to speak. It's a summary of the event overall with all of the different sessions. And so we plan to take the inputs that are coming in and do what we can to feed those inputs into the GLF outcome statement. And that goes out to a lot of people. And of course, your inputs also inform the work that we are doing. So now if we're going to ask you to go back to Slido, we've been focusing on the chat box. We had the Slido word cloud there. And so we're going to ask you to go back now to Slido. So if you're not in Slido already, perhaps if our tech support can bring up the screen for Slido. That's the word cloud. So if you go to Slido, and log in to Slido. I don't know whether or not there's the login details that are available, but the website for Slido is sli.do. Put in hashtag GLF biodiversity, and then our session, which when you go to the sessions there, our session is the C4 rights session. So once you go into Slido, you'll see a list of different GLF sessions, and this session is C4 rights, and so you can see that there on the screen. So if you can go to Slido, that would be fantastic. And so our first question is focused on the topic of rights. And so we've heard a lot about rights during the course of this session. We've heard from Nonette Royo, who's a lawyer working with Indigenous communities and rights. We've heard from Tonio, who's involved in some really interesting work, especially in the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity and Indigenous people's rights. And this is a very much an issue of increasing importance in a number of these spaces. One of the points that Nonette made, which I think is a very important point, is that the point that there's a lot of law that exists already, but a lot of it isn't actually being enforced. And so, and the question of rights and enforcement of rights and recognition of tenure is something that is very much in the hands of governments around the world. And so what we would be asking the audience to provide us with responses to is this question here: what can be done to ensure governments enhance support for rights-based ecosystem approaches for a just green recovery? So there are these different types of rights: collective rights, individual rights, customary rights, legal rights. And so start entering information in there. We'll give you some time there to start entering that information. And perhaps whilst the audience is putting information into the box, we'll turn back to Nonette, who we're grateful to be with us to give a keynote address. And perhaps Nonette, you could provide us with a few thoughts that you have on what more can governments be doing to be ensuring support for rights-based approaches.
Thank you, Steve. What's really important is that governments are bound by their own laws and procedures, and they are not homogeneous. There are many different layers. There's the national, there's the regional, subnational, and there's the village. So what has worked and what we have over time and over the years really been effective is when the people themselves organized in villages and among broader jurisdictions decide and opt for using those basic laws and regulations. And these can even come in the planning. There are laws that bind and guide budgeting at all levels, at all districts, up to the village, where planning and participation of people in planning is very important. So Indigenous peoples, the one that we have worked with in local communities, have used effectively these types of opportunities to communicate to different levels of government, to understand what these roles are, for example, protecting watersheds, commons, areas that everybody cares about. Yeah, there's water, there's all of these other issues, ecosystem services among them, conservation even, and the different parts of and the difficulties in implementing that without local people is felt by many government officials. So governments see this language when it's used. That's why rights are important, because they can come to the table, they meaning the local communities, can come to the table and say, we are part of this negotiation, we're citizens, this is evidence, we exist here. And you can go and check and verify. Even prior to titling, evidence of existence of peoples and communities is very important. So that's how we penetrate what governments can do, this at national levels. Now, global is different. And I think this is when these pledges, the Paris Agreement, and all these other international instruments that some governments have agreed to can be very useful also. I think that, I hope that's helpful. Yeah.
Thanks, Nonette. Perhaps now we'll also hear from Tonio on this question. But Tonio, you're based in Canada. Canada has a fairly significantly well-resourced system when it comes to engagement with Indigenous communities in Canada. But we do hear differing views on this. It'd be good to hear from you. What's the government doing in Canada? Or even more so, what are the challenges associated? What's the government not doing in Canada that it could be doing better? Or what sort of lessons could be drawn from the experience in Canada that could perhaps be applied in other places?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. It's a great question. I have to reflect that engaging in an international context, we tend to highlight what Canada is doing positively, and certainly in the last few years, there's been much more to talk about in a positive vein. But working domestically within the national context, there is still so much to do, and we have so many challenges. So while there's a degree of recognition of Indigenous rights, we see that process is very slow. We see that the recognition of rights only goes so far, and then it becomes very sort of challenging to in fact advance in many respects the implementation of those rights and the authorities and jurisdiction that are associated with rights. And that is an evolving process, and that's the advocacy that we do with the national government. The good thing is that we can get through the door. So bringing that back to the international context, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a critically important document or convention that has been adopted in the UN context, but is challenged with respect to its actual implementation in the various countries around the world. We see in Canada that there's a commitment to in fact create legislation to adopt the UN declaration, but that is a slow process, and the question of what that will look like on the ground, of course, is in many respects also still to be determined. But that is perhaps the most important thing that we could focus on in this moment, just given the decades of work that it took to get the UN declaration to be adopted by the General Assembly. Now the work needs to be about recognizing that declaration in all of the other conventions. So in the CBD context, for example, we actually have a real challenge getting the parties to recognize and include reference to the UN declaration in the work of the CBD. Two bodies that are in fact related, created under the UN, and we still have that kind of resistance by parties. So advocacy from all of us in all corners, in all of our countries, would be a critical thing to be focused on in terms of answering this question.
Thanks, Tonio. Moving forward, now we heard Virginia speaking about terminology, and Virginia looked at the international policy context. We've heard a number of references to this idea of solutions. We've looked at the term nature-based solution. Nature-based solutions. This has come up consistently, and I expect that this is something that will be coming up throughout the GLF in a number of different sessions. And so our second question seeks to look at this, but more in a slightly different light. What we are looking at, or what we're looking for in terms of answers on this question, is more about responsibility. So it's more about whose solutions are we talking about? Are we talking about solutions for local communities? Or are we talking about solutions for high emitting countries, for example? Whose solutions are we talking about when we're talking about nature-based solutions? So this next question is, and it's now on your screen, so we're still in Slido, so we're moving on to question 2. Solutions is a popular term these days, and we see much about nature-based solutions. And so when we use the word solutions, what are the most important challenges that we are needing to solve? So what are the most important challenges that we're needing to solve when we are approaching a solution? Is it a solution to climate change? Is it a solution to biodiversity loss? Is it all of the above? So this is something, if people can start to populate the Slido session there, we'll turn now to Kate. So Kate, it'd be great to hear from you on this session, on this question. During your session, you'd express some concerns about the nature-based solutions framing or terminology. It'd be good to hear more from you in terms of the types of solutions that your understanding nature-based solutions is seeking to address, and perhaps even how that might be different to the types of things that ecosystem-based solutions are seeking to address. So perhaps we'll cross over to you there, Kate, in Melbourne, and you can share a few thoughts on this one.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Steve. Well, I think the term ecosystem-based solutions or ecosystem approaches, which is which is adopted or in the CBD, or really the CBD is founded on that concept, is much more specific than nature-based solutions in terms of it tells us exactly what is the solution, which is ecosystems. And as Virginia, I won't repeat all of what Virginia said, but she explained very well the importance of stable, resilient, and biodiverse ecosystems to underpin ecological functioning. So the problem we get into with nature-based solutions is, I think you phrased it very well in terms of whose solutions and what is the problem we're attempting to solve. It's quite a vague term, and in terms of both the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, I think the problem we're trying to solve is really increasing human pressure on the environment. So consumption, human pressure through lots of different mechanisms is degrading ecosystems globally, apart from those islands of nature, I think is how Tonio put it, but when he was talking about Indigenous peoples' lands. And then more specifically than just talking broadly about human pressure is the extraction and burning of fossil fuels. And we need to stop that. We totally bringing that down to zero in order to address climate change, as well as more broadly reducing human pressure to address the biodiversity loss. Now, nature-based solutions, I think it was in Virginia's presentation when she talked about the use of the word net in the CBD and the UNFCCC, starts to sidestep or subvert that solution. If it's not a solution, if saving nature means we can burn more fossil fuels, then that's not a solution. If saving nature in one place means we can lose it in another place, that's not a solution. So it's really important when we talk about solutions that they're not trade-offs, one for the other, but we're actually looking squarely at what the problem is and specifically at what the solutions are. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Kate. Christopher, perhaps we can turn to you. I know that you've been looking very closely at nature-based solutions. You've been following this work closely. You followed the nature-based solutions platform at the Climate Summit. I know that you're looking closely at what the Standing Committee on Finance is doing and doing some work there internally at CIFOR. It'd be good to hear from you on this question. When we're talking about solutions, what are we looking for solutions for at the moment in your view?
Yes, thanks, Steve. And I won't repeat what Kate already said, because I fully endorse that. Nature-based solutions cannot become sort of the fig leaf for continued fossil fuel emissions. And it always strikes me that we are talking a lot about nature-based solutions, which are 30% of the emissions, but our circles it's natural that we talk about this, but globally, talk is much less about, and also in the UNFCCC is much less about actually how to reduce fossil fuels, and I think that's a real concern. But I also, coming back particularly to the nature-based solutions, it's a term that originally struck me as original and simple. You know, you don't say something like ecosystems, which is always putting people off. Oh gosh, what is this? So you say nature, but also it sort of repeats what we have been seeing in the development debate over the last basically decades. You know, people go from one big easy silver bullet solution to the next in the course of 5 to 10 years. You know, REDD+ didn't work, let's do restoration. Oh, restoration didn't work, let's do nature-based solutions. At the end, what all this shies away from is actually implementing solutions fully by looking at the whole mechanisms of how to make things work. Basically, very often you see those solutions that they're missing a proper theory of how the change will be implemented and effectuated. The transformation from A to B, from the current status to the future status. It's not just, you know, it struck me that Nonette in the beginning said rights are relational, and I thought everything is relational, and we always look at things without looking at the relations between things. So we see a piece of degraded land and we say, though, this should be a forest, nature-based solutions. Come in there, magic. But this magic needs to happen by efforts, and these efforts need to be described and planned and worked on. And these are regulations, these are laws, these are motivation, this is capacity development. This means bringing finance in ways that can actually be used by people on the ground, and there is a lot that needs to be done, and that is not get done if you just jump on the higher level from one big topic to the next big topic, because the practical problems at the end are always the same. The implementation is very often the same, and it happens in the same arena, so to say, the policy arena, the collaboration, the laws, the finance, the economics, and so on. And at the end, I think so if you look at nature-based solutions, it focuses you on the nature element, which is of course good because there is something that needs to be done, but it takes your attention away from everything that is around it, and that's, I think, much better encapsulated in the just green transition word, or you know, we need a transition, we need looking at those changes and how to implement them, and we need to be very, very sure that they are just and fair. I think the world needs a lot more focus currently on inequality than we are currently seeing, and that actually feeds back into the development debate and into the environmental debate.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Chris. And maybe very quickly, Virginia, if we can just hear from you just very quickly. We're really starting to get to the end of the session, and this question around solutions. As you work in both of these different big policy processes at the international level. They're talking about nature-based solutions more in the climate conference context, and they talk about ecosystem-based approaches, which some people also talk about as ecosystem-based solutions in the CBD. Because perhaps hear from you very quickly on just some of the sort of key differences that you're seeing when it comes to the nature-based solutions discourse and the ecosystem-based approach discourse.
The issue gets obscured by the terms, and really what we need to do in both spaces is prioritise protection of ecosystems in the best condition and restore those that are not. And that's the same imperative whether you're talking about climate action or biodiversity action. And so I find the terms unhelpful because they don't take people to the priority actions that are needed to tackle the climate and biodiversity crises. And if you don't tackle them both together, then you'll fail on both. So the challenges in the conventions is to develop, I think, a joint work program and to help the UNFCCC in particular actually operationalise the ecosystem provisions of the convention and the Paris Agreement, which has never been done. So I would argue that there needs to be a joint subs to work program between the two conventions to look at how you deliver integrated synergistic outcomes for climate and biodiversity. And I'd drop use of the terms. EBA is better than nature-based solutions, but it still doesn't help people prioritise the actions that are needed. And that is protecting our primary carbon-dense ecosystems, which is the activity at scale that matters for climate and biodiversity, and then restoring, buffering, reconnecting, using tools like connectivity conservation, other effective conservation measures, bringing some of those concepts across into the climate space to rebuild the integrity of ecosystems and their stability, which is urgent. We're getting so close to tipping points. If we don't act to protect and restore in ecologically meaningful ways, we will utterly fail on both crises.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for that, Virginia. And I think as a personal reflection on this question of terms and terminology, I mean, perhaps people that are working in the policy spaces in some ways getting a bit, and I hate to say it, but maybe a little bit lazy. I mean, we need to be spelling these things out a little bit more, and we need to be we need to sort of move away from things being so reliant on acronyms determining. Take RED Plus, for example. The acronym RED Plus has essentially become a label in and of itself. And I think that it begins to lose some of its true nuance and some of its true meaning. And if we're giving everything sort of buzz terms as we go through, then I think that we start to lose some of the complexity in some ways. And it really does begin to mean very many things to very many people. And that can be both good and bad. And so being able to unpack these things and spell them out more and go into more detail in terms of the complexity when policies and laws are being designed and developed might be something worth considering. So we need to move on now to the end of the session. We only have a few minutes left. So Aya has been again sort of going through the chat and listening to our speakers, and so I want to cross over to Aya, who has a few sort of takeaway points there as a bit of a wrap for us. So over to you, Aya.
Thank you, Steve. So yes, I've been trying to get as much as I can from the session, and it's been a really rich discussion. I probably have missed some points, but these are the ones that really stood out for me. So I did hear from the speakers and from the exchanges among the participants about being careful how we label things. So again, the term nature-based and nature-based solutions, nature-based by itself or solutions by itself have all these meanings and interpretations. So we need to be careful about how we use them and always going back to the importance of rights and ecosystems. So that is one of my takeaways. Another one is related to financing. And I think Chris and Nonette both spoke to this point that financing needs to increase for promoting and protecting Indigenous people's rights. But it's not just a matter of higher numbers of financing or funding, but really about how the financing is used, making sure that we localize the financial flows and enabling environments and access by the people who need the most. And another big area of discussion, I think, is about rights. From the keynote, we heard this, and from much of the discussion, talking about rights has to be nuanced. It is relational. We talk about rights in terms of how humans relate to one another, but also how we relate to nature. And we have even touched about the rights of nature. So this is another area. And I guess on the last point that Virginia made about tackling climate change and biodiversity jointly. So we weren't able to touch much on this among the questions in the chat box, but there were also a few points about what to do about these international instruments. We have all of these instruments that talk about these things, but how are we using these processes? So I think it's a good point to end on that Virginia touched on it. And I think this is also one of my main takeaways about tackling climate change and biodiversity jointly. I totally agree that these are major crises that the whole globe is facing, that if we do not find ways to really integrate our approaches to them, not just at the international level, but especially how we are handling these crises at the national and community levels, then we will probably fail at addressing both of them. So those are my main takeaways. Maybe Steve has a few more that he wants to add.
Really, I mean, I think that you summed it up. I think that, that for me, I think that the one of the things that stood out the most here is the cautionary tale that probably needs to be told here in the context of how we go about approaching nature-based solutions. I think and placing more emphasis on rights-based approaches, I think is one of the things that's really come out in a big way. And I am very much enjoying seeing the way that there is an increasing emphasis on rights. We're seeing it coming up more and more in a number of different forums. And so hopefully that momentum can continue to build. And so that's all we have time for. So thanks very much to everybody at home, or whether you're in your office and you've been participating online. I think the participation online has been really rich, and so it's great that you've stayed online during the course of the event. Thanks to our speakers, Nonette, for your keynote, and thanks very much to Kate, Virginia, Tonio, and Chris. A very special thanks to you, Aya, for your assistance here with the facilitation. Moving across these multiple digital platforms gets a bit difficult. Thanks very much to the organisations, and so C4 for hosting the event, and to the Tenure Facility and the Forest Peoples Program for all of your efforts with assisting with the organisation. And of course, thanks to the Global Landscapes Forum and the technical support crew in the lead up to this and during the course of the event. MJ, thanks to you for your support there. He's not on the screen, but MJ's there behind the scenes, helping us out to make sure that everything's going well. And so that's it for today. Now, one final message: if you are in the US, don't forget to vote. All right, so that's the final message from this session. So thanks very much, everybody, and hopefully we'll be able to pull a group like this together again at another GLF, either in the same session or in separate sessions. So thanks very much, and again, good morning, good afternoon, or good night. Thank you. Can you still...
My name is Carolina Santamaria, and I'm the Forest Program Officer at the CBD Secretariat. So you're joining us at the CBD COP13 here in Cancun, Mexico. So today marks a very important day for the CBD, given that this is the first time we have a gender day specifically focused in the Rio Convention's Pavilion. And the Pavilion has been a long-time effort among several partners, which include the GEF, the CBD Secretariat, the UNFCCC Secretariat, and the UNCCD Secretariat, in an effort to bring to different audiences, different publics, some of the key issues that are happening around biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. And gender is one of the key issues that we'd like to emphasize today in this special day on gender. So gender is an important component in sustainable wildlife management, and it's something that was manifested today in the launch of a new publication, a new fact sheet that the CPW, this is the Collaborative Partnership on Sustainable Wildlife Management, a partnership made up of 14 different international organizations, have collectively joined forces to bring to you the best knowledge, the best available science on the issues of wildlife management and how gender plays a role, why it's important, and what are some of the responses that countries and organizations are using in their different initiatives to demonstrate gender in different applications on wildlife management. So we have heard a mixture of messages today. We had a very diverse panel that was composed of experts from the CPW and many countries that have been taking strong efforts to integrate gender into their practices, into policies, into natural resource management, and also demonstrating that there are challenges ahead and that there are different ways to tackle the issues of gender. And among the key focus areas that were emphasized in the press brief and the fact sheet that was prepared were the issues of sustainable livelihoods, an issue that was also emphasized in an example on the all-female patrolling of the Black Mambas, which is an anti-patrolling unit in South Africa, and how this example can provide a way for bridging wildlife conservation to local communities. There were other examples as well on the implications of gender to food security and to nutrition and to health, human health. And a lot of this science, a lot of these studies are coming from partners like CIFOR, where these issues are resonating in the bushmeat sector and the need to look for new solutions which relate to governance and which relate to statistics that are important for us to understand which species have an emphasis and have a role in this type of issue. Other priorities that were emphasized today also include the issue of human-wildlife conflicts and how different countries are tackling this issue through different gender-responsive feedback and initiatives that have been carried out. And we heard a lot also of the gender dynamics in illegal wildlife trade, where in some countries, women play a strong role in the trafficking of illegal wildlife. While in issues of poaching, there has been a more male-dominant interface and experience. We have also seen a very important role in decision-making and in the institutional building that many countries are trying to factor in a more diverse setting in management and in institutions where women are playing a stronger role, are becoming more empowered, and are finding new tools to take on more leadership roles. And I think all these issues, including ownership, governance, land rights, they resonate among various different countries that spoke today and are picked up in the policy brief that the CPW has prepared.
This is Langkat Timur Laut Wildlife Reserve, declared as Wildlife Reserve in 1983, and it was damaged in between 1985 to 1987, and was restored by the government, local community, and NGO around here at 2005 till 2008. Now it's growing again, and a lot of ecosystem services enjoyed and provide a lot of services to the local community, mainly the mud crab hatching here, which can produce 3 to 5 kilograms per day per person. So the reserve really is making lots of profits for the community. With the competition in terms of the survival rate in this particular reserve.
I guess one of the major problems is climatic changes obviously influence microclimates in particular environments. One of the major habitats that's been affected are montane environments. And as temperatures rise, many of the microhabitats for plants which require sort of niche climatic regimes, they either migrate upwards or they become extinct. And that's been one of the major problems on Mount Kenya, for example, the mountains of East Africa, but also in the Andes and other mountainous regions. And losing these alpine specialists in particular may not seem like a big deal, but it does have a huge impact on global biodiversity, because many of these mountain ranges house many endemic and rare species. It's the same kind of thing, and certainly again in montane environments, those that are niche specialists at certain altitudes are being forced further and further and further higher as temperatures increase. But one of the biggest issues obviously is habitat loss and conversion. As forests become drier, for example, they become more prone to fire, and so many of the animals that occur within tend to lose their habitat, and then you have the concomitant problems of human-wildlife conflict and extirpation. And so the obvious classic example is the polar bear. Loss of the Arctic ice, although not a forest environment as we know, has had a huge impact on the polar bear populations of the Arctic. I guess one of the major possible hotspots, if you like, of climate change affecting biodiversity is the Sundarbans, the mangrove region of Bangladesh. Many people rely on that area for their livelihoods. It's also the last vestige of the taiga for that region, and ultimately losing the two, the livelihood aspect and the conservation value of the taiga would be somewhat catastrophic. And there have been numerous floods there in the past which give us a taste for how things will be in the future. And those people living in the Sundarbans will be forced to move off into elsewhere in Bangladesh, and there simply is no more land. So in terms of cultivation, habitation, it's going to be very difficult for them to integrate. And one key aspect of climate change that was often underlooked is we're going to be seeing in the next 20 to 50 years millions and millions and millions of climate change refugees, environmental refugees in fact, and they're going to be impinging onto areas already habited, areas already being farmed, and so there's going to be a considerable estimating social conflict that accompanies those migration patterns. The real value of biodiversity in terms of climate change in its ability to adapt is it provides resilience. And a great example is that when you have periods of agricultural shortfalls or famine due to climate-induced events, often people rely back on biodiversity for their sustenance, for foods, medicines, and what they require a more diversified, if you like, livelihoods portfolio, which biodiversity really does provide. And ultimately, that is key to the survival of many rural communities, the ability to fall back on the safety nets of biodiversity, if you like. So one of the major impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss is essentially related to our food security. We currently rely on only 3 major crops for 50% of our nutritional intake, and these are wheat, maize and rice. The main problem with relying on such a narrow cropping base is that those particular crops are very vulnerable to climate change. We saw major food shortages in 2008 based on climate vicissitudes in Russia and Pakistan, and today the corn crop in the US is failing, which is going to have a huge impact on food prices and global security. The Arab Spring was brought about because of the huge increase in food prices in 2008. And so there are not only sort of biological and social implications of climate change and biodiversity loss, but there are also strong political and social unrest issues that are very, very much linked as well. And one major way of doing so is many of our partner centres are working with local farmers to protect agrobiodiversity and other forms of biodiversity, and essentially working with local people who have the traditional knowledge and long-term commitment to conserving this agricultural biodiversity is key. In fact, much of the agrobiodiversity we're concerned about are conserved by women, and women farmers, female farmers, tend to be much more diversified in terms of their cropping portfolio and have a long-term investment in using their knowledge to protect many of this agrobiodiversity that we're interested in. It needs to be a much more nuanced focus on biodiversity and climate change link issues, rather than just saying, climate change is having an effect and sea levels are rising, because biodiversity provides the basis of life on Earth, and the intrinsic value of biodiversity is often, one, misunderstood, and secondly, undervalued. And the changes that are occurring because of climate change are extremely important, and we need to understand them better.